Reflection 2, Take 2. I went to Africa a couple times. I was immersed in their culture and their ways and got to experience a lot of different people. And what I got to experience, according to what we've been reading in class and the lecture, especially from the book John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom, I realized that my experience didn't represent the actual history of what Africa has experienced in general. And I guess much to my disliking, I realized that Africa is full of brutal truths and actually a rough history among its people. And I also realized reading the book is that there's a lot of similar features that take place from the infrastructure of slave trade in Africa to Spanish colonization and slaves in America. And I just want to talk about that. And in chapter 1 of the book, From Slavery to Freedom, slavery is mentioned to be there from the start of Africa, and that it's sad that based off from a resource, one was born into a powerful place or a not so powerful place, and slaves that were captured from other powerful empires were captured because they didn't have the resources, such as copper or gold or ivory or any sort of agriculture. And throughout the history, that's sort of what happened, is you have all these different regions that have these different resources, and that's what ended up making these slave trades start happening, was the necessity for resources. And that really defined who you were as a person depending on where you lived in Africa. And during that time, agriculture was obviously really huge, and so women were sold from a 2-to-1 ratio in the trans-Saharan trade because they were good at agriculture, which is very different from the Atlantic trade where men were sold 2-to-1, because that was predominantly labor, like mining and stuff like that, was happening. And obviously with researchers come empires, and Ghana was one of the huge players in the trade originally. They saw the huge value of trade, and they took advantage of the trans-Saharan trade, and because they had gold, they had it all. So what they ended up doing was taking control of that whole trade. And with every empire, there's rises and falls. So you have the Mali rise, which they also continued to take over the trade in the trans-Saharan trade because of gold from the Niger River and agriculture. And after they fell, the rise of Shangali, which was ruled by Askia Muhammad. He encouraged learning and prosperity among his people. He also surprisingly built an army out of slaves and prisoners, and that was to protect the infrastructure, to protect what they had over the resources. And he also, I think, in my opinion, was a huge pusher in trying to get educated for defining what a slave was. He talked to a lot of different people, like lawyers and just educated people, like that you would like assume are high society people. And so with that, you see a lot of the infrastructure from resources and power. Like that's the two things that I see. And even with Spanish colonization into North America, you have lands. Like it's a new land. Like there's tons of resources there. That's what's going on. And you see Spanish coming over and saying, "Oh, Ghana's got it going on. Like we're gonna learn from them. Like okay, cool. We're gonna see how they trade people." And slaves were a huge success in why Spain was so successful in Central and South America, which is called which they called La Flora or La Florida, which is Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia as we know them today. And actually, so, an interesting fact is that Spain uh, uh, produced St. Augustine, which is the oldest successful European settlement in North America, which I thought was fascinating. But also during Spanish Louisiana, after they established their land and got everything going on, they got resources, they got slaves that basically took over people's lands and helped fight secure that kind of area for them. Even later, the French and empires they took over. French took over, then Spanish took over, and kind of undid some of the roots that they had as far as slaves. So there was all this different slave this are defined as this, and slaves here are defined as this. So there's a lot of contradictory stuff between the social properties of what took place then and into the new world. And there's like this constant cycle, and you realize, for example, the French wanted them slaves to stay together as a family, where versus the Spanish were like, no, doesn't doesn't work for us, slavery, and so they break up the families, and they started putting more regulations on blacks and free blacks, and just like in Africa, in the inner trade, like you had the rich and the not rich, so you were either considered high poverty in the military or low poverty in agriculture. So there's a lot of this contrast between what you are as a black person and what you aren't, between just the internal parts of Africa's slave trade and the Spanish coming into America. I just find it really fascinating that there's always this cycle. It's a resource, it's land, and then it's power. And like who has the power defines what happens to people. And I just think overall that's sad, and I feel that obviously in this day and age, like I feel like that cycle's hopefully getting broken. At least in my opinion, I hope that, and I think that that cycle's getting broken as we get more educated about what transpires, and books like Slavery to Freedom can produce the not non-repeat of history, and to really show people that we care as people and progress in a way, in a manner that's more humane and equal for everyone.